Сучасніші отці, шановні члени та прихильники НДШ в Канаді, достойні гості і дорогі студенти. Це була моя сестра, голова Монреальського осередку НТШ, яка мала відкрити сесію і привітати вас на цій сесії в серії доповідей на теми українського вкладу у цивілізацію. А я переберу тепер провід сесії від сестри, якої так чи так нема, через інтернет. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our presentation. It gives me tremendous pleasure to introduce our two presenters to you. Nadia Demko. Nadia was born in Winnipeg to immigrant parents and has always had the Ukrainian community as a focus in her life through organizations such as Plast, Rusalka Dance Ensemble, Saint Vladimir and Olha Cathedral Choir, among others. When she moved to Montreal to pursue science and medical studies, she joined the Ukrainian community there, and that was a priority for her. She became very active through student organizations like the McGill University Students Association, eventually becoming president, as well as the Ukrainian Canadian Students Union as secretary, and executive vice president and alumni director. Throughout her student years, she organized and participated in many film screenings, protests, awareness campaigns, book launches, concerts, policy meetings, and congresses. She also performed in Joint MUSA, that's the McGill University Students Association, and the McGill Faculty of Music concert as a soprano soloist, and sang recreationally with the ensemble Surme for multiple years. She was also a youth counselor for both Help Us Help the Children and Plast camps. Since starting her residency in pathology, Nadia has joined the Ukrainian National Federation in Montreal, first as an active donations committee member, and now as a board member and the first chair of the Cultural Committee. Since early 2021, Nadia has organized multiple cultural events, both virtual and in person, with the aim of showcasing professional Ukrainian artists and high-caliber Ukrainian art forms. Notably, she co-organized an anniversary concert in the Montreal community, marking the 30th anniversary of Ukraine's independence in 2021, as well as one marking the 90th anniversary of the Ukrainian National Federation in 2022. Since the start of Russia's horrific war in Ukraine, she has become a very strong advocate on the cultural front, countering Russia's war, publishing in Montreal's La Presse an article called Cessons la guerre culturelle contre l'Ukraine, as well as the classical music journal La Scène, Russia's cultural war against Ukraine, a Montreal story. This has been republished in French for La Parole Ukrainienne de Paris. Nadia now lives in New York City, where she is specializing in hematopathology, where she immediately joined also the ensemble Ukrainian Village Voices and consistently makes an effort to attend Ukrainian cultural events. It's equally a great pleasure to introduce to you Leah Batstone, whom I did not know before. I knew Nadia practically since she arrived in Montreal. Leah is a musicologist working at the intersections of art music, politics, and philosophy in Central and Eastern Europe. And she's the creative director of the Ukrainian Contemporary Music Festival in New York City. Currently on a postdoctoral fellowship for the University of Vienna's Rewire program, Emeris Sklodowska-Curie Actions Project co-fund supported by the European Commission. She received her PhD in musicology from McGill University and holds a master's in musicology from the University of Oxford. Her first book, Mahler's Nietzsche, Politics and Philosophy in the Wunderhorn Symphony, was published with Boydell and Brewer in January. She is currently working on her second monograph concerning Ukrainian musical modernism, preparing a proposal for a handbook to the First Symphony of Stefania Turkevich, and is co-editing the volume Perspectives on Ukrainian Music with Peter Schmelz for Indiana University Press. In addition to organizing the annual Ukrainian Contemporary Music Festival, she serves as creative director of the sold-out concert Notes from Ukraine, 100 Years of Carol of the Bells at Carnegie Hall in December 2022, which celebrated the North American premiere of Shevchenko and was instrumental in facilitating the Ukrainian chorus Demko of New York's appearance on NBC's Saturday Night Live following the start of Russia's full-scale invasion. Please join me in welcoming these two wonderful presenters, and I will now give them the microphone and mute myself. May I just add that at the end, there will be a chance for questions, both in English and Ukrainian.
Thank you, Professor Zhuk. Thanks for having us, and thanks to the NTSH, Shevchenko Scientific Society Montreal chapter, especially for inviting us. So I'll begin, but basically our talk today is aims at discussing how we can begin decolonizing Ukrainian culture. And I have the pleasure to speak today with Leah Batstone, who you've heard from her extensive, impressive bio, completed her PhD at McGill in musicology. And even before she was organizing such high caliber events like the 100th anniversary at Carnegie Hall of Shevchenko and the Ukrainian Contemporary Music Festival in New York City, she was very involved at the McGill Ukrainian Students Association level, organizing such events as an evening of Ukrainian songs, where we had music students from the Schulich School of Music sing Ukrainian repertoire. So that was spearheaded by Leah, among many other fantastic events. I have at the bottom there a Gerdane making workshop that she organized, among many other Musa events. So we go back to our student days, and it's really a pleasure to be here today with Leah. Sorry? Yes, and just to add that she's actually joining us from Lviv today. She's doing archival work at UKU, so she'll speak a bit about that, but I think it's really an honor to be able to have her here. So just to kind of get started with a quote, if you're not on the front line, there's a lot of work in the background. This was said by Serhiy Sadi, who's actually helping, who's been helping with the Ukrainian Kyiv movement, and specifically with sanding down a Soviet monument. So I think this has sort of been the driving force for many of us who are involved to some extent in the cultural scene during this war. And it hasn't been hard to become involved, unfortunately, in Montreal. There's been one of our big orchestras, the Orchestre Symphonique de Montréal, has continuously had a very pro-Russian repertoire and program, even since the start of the full-scale invasion last year in February. So initially, there was a concert scheduled in March 2022 with Russian pianist Alexander Malofeev. That was canceled. However, after that point, basically, they went back on that first move. The OSM director said that she got a lot of backlash related to this canceling. So after that, actually was a kind of complete turn of events where they continued to have Russian programming. In April, of note, there was this concert with Danil Trifonov called Russian Concertos and French Tone Poems. There were many issues with this concert. Firstly, I mean, it's a Russian performer. I think in a time when we have availability of many different artists, I think that was, a questionable choice. But beyond that, he made a very weak statement. You can see here on the right, very just generic, war is a tragedy, and he's praying for solution to bring long-lasting peace. So this typical inability to actually name the aggressor, aka Russia, and to actually take a stance on the issue. And then the other issue with this concert, of course, was that it was called Russian concertos when the two so-called Russian composers were Shnitsky and Prokofiev. Shnitsky, of course, was a German Jewish heritage. Prokofiev, of course, was born in Donetsk, and none of that was explained. So that was part of my response in La Presse was kind of highlighting these points to the head of the OSM at that time. And basically since then, you can see here, I have just a few examples, but it's been a lot of Russian music, Russian composers, Shostakovich, Stravinsky. They invited Trifonov yet again. So they've continuously continued a Russian programming. And yes, Madeleine Capot was the director of the OSM who quoted, sorry, I'm just getting admit, who said, you know, music should not be political, and she received a lot of backlash. And you can see here, nous sommes à recevoir une bonne presse à l'étranger. On a trouvé cela très difficile. So basically she's saying we received bad press because of the canceling of Malofeev. And that has been very difficult for the orchestra to handle. Of course, that's kind of victimizing you know, the orchestra and not the true victims who are, of course, in Ukraine. And, you know, what I say to people who say, you know, we shouldn't be canceling Russian culture is, I think when people get uncomfortable or cite cancel culture or argue that music should not be political, I think it's important to reflect on the way music and culture has not only disseminated Russian propaganda, but has also attempted to erase Ukrainian cultural history. So I think that's the message that I would say to people who are overly concerned about so-called cancel culture. And just to show on the left, to highlight kind of in contrast to what Madeleine Capot was saying, you know, bigger and brighter orchestras have been able to move away from Russian performers, most notably the Met canceling, you know, the Russian soprano Netrebko. You know, it cost them a lot of money, but nonetheless, they stood by that decision among others. Sorry, I'm just pressing next and it's not going. Oh, there we go. So yeah, this is just to highlight that this wasn't, it didn't just start with the full-scale invasion of the war. There's been a long history in Montreal of Russophilia, unfortunately. You know, we had performers like Matsuev and Gergiev who appeared multiple times with the OSM from 2011 to 2020. And there's been many other examples, you know, some of them a little more local, but still prominent classical music groups like Chœur Classique de Montréal, Ensemble Vocal Circa Terra. Of note, one of their concerts, they actually entitled Jewels of famous Russian composers, and one of the composers they showcased was Bortyansky. So many issues there. And yeah, in 2019, the Red Army Choir performed in Montreal, which to me was actually quite horrific. Even people at work had mentioned, I thought of you, it's Russian music. That made me think of you. That's basically your culture, right? So I think it just showcases how much work there still is to do in calling out, you know, the Red Army is a genocidal regime, and to have had a choir representing that regime attend and perform at the Place des Arts in 2019 is already, when the war was going on, is quite problematic. And I detail some of those examples in my letter in La Sena. And yes, and just to mention, UCC did call for boycotting Matsuev and Gergiev at one point in 2019. And again, they didn't, the OSM did not do anything in response to that. So just another example, Zhenya actually Ninovna pointed this out to me. I knew of Les Saisons Russes, but they recently rebranded themselves as Les Printemps Slaves. They rebranded themselves, as they explain on their website, because they experienced a terrible heartbreak in 2022. Again, highlighting, victimizing themselves, you know, making it about themselves, not even mentioning Ukraine there. And they say, art and music can serve as a bulwark against the destructive forces that assail us, and that artists of all origin should form a united front against barbarism and violence. Again, very generic, not naming the actual aggressor, not naming Russia, so problems, many issues there. And then the concert that they recently organized in June, was called Music in Exile, where essentially they compare the plight of all Slavs exiling their country following the outbreak of war. So, they discuss Russian artists who had to leave Russia and kind of compare that to Ukrainian artists having to leave Ukraine. And then, of course, in homage to that, organize a concert with Stravinsky, Rachmaninov, Ikramova, so all Russian composers with a bit of Chopin. So just to highlight that their whole programming has essentially been like a pool of Russian composers interspersed with some Ukrainian artists, and some Czech artists there as well, and Chopin, but mostly Russian artists again. So it's not, for an organization that's claiming to try to represent a diverse group of Slavic people, it's not very diverse. And to contrast that, I want to highlight a positive example in Montreal. It hasn't been all bad. The Orchestre Classique de Montréal, another large orchestra in the city, OCM, has actually been a Ukrainian cultural pillar in the city, largely thanks to Taras Kulish, who's a colleague of mine who I had the pleasure of working with the Ukrainian National Federation Montreal branch. This is just an example of the upcoming program for an October concert entitled Slava Ukraini. You can see it's in contrast to the last program that we saw with Les Printemps Slaves. It's largely Ukrainian composers, Latoshinsky, Kapustin, Lysenko, Bornyansky, and a Ukrainian Canadian composer, Joanna Storoshchuk. And this hasn't been the first concert. They previously organized Echoes of the Steppes last year, among others. And they are beyond just having Ukrainian composers, they also have Ukrainian artists. So you can see on the side, Ihor Mostove, shout out to him, because actually the concert that I mentioned that Leah organized back in our student days in 2015, Ihor Mostove actually sang at that concert. So he's also a McGill alumnus, among other Ukrainian artists that you see there, Serhiy Salov, Yuri Konevich. So really bravo to the OCM. They've been doing incredible work for that. And I'd be remiss if I didn't point out some of the concerts we organized just over the past few years. Among them, some big celebratory concerts to try to highlight Ukrainian artists and composers. At the last one, we actually also celebrated the 150th anniversary of Solomia Krushenitska's birthday. So we sang, sorry, not we, but Aline Kutan sang Un bel de vedremos from Madame Butterfly, and that was the opera that Solomia Krushenitska made famous. So that was a nice homage to her. And, we played, we had other Ukrainian composers like Anna Pitvorna, who's a Ukrainian Canadian composer. Karissa Klapushak played some of her really interesting music. We had Serhiy Salov, who's always performs superbly. And we had the Andronati duo, who was actually a married couple that moved from Lviv, and they performed beautifully as well. Some very classics of Ukrainian song. And because I'm in New York, it's been really interesting to sort of see what's been happening here. And as Leah will be speaking to, this is largely Leah, the Notes from Ukraine concert and the Ukrainian Contemporary Music Festival. They've been at the forefront of the work being done here. But there's been just to point out some of the other events that have happened is the Ukrainian Institute of America has been organizing classical music concerts thanks to Solomia Ivakiv. She's a violinist, but she's also on the Ukrainian Institute's board. And what's interesting is you'll notice, like in the programming, it's usually showcasing one or two Ukrainian artists, like Roslavets in this one, Stuchevsky, who's Ukrainian Jewish, and Kuzmenko, who's a Ukrainian Canadian. So she'll often showcase one or two Ukrainian composers, and the rest of the program you'll notice is, basically other composers. Kodale, who's Hungarian, Smetana, and I think Dvorak was also showcased. Was also showcased at this one, and they're of course of Czech descent. So just to highlight that, I think even if you're not making an all-Ukrainian program, you can have a program that's not all Russian in the background. So I think that diversity has been very nice to see. And just to briefly touch upon as well, like of course, if you can't talk about Ukrainian music without mentioning groups like Okan Elze or Jamala. I had the pleasure of recently attending both of their concerts, and they've been incredible. The Jamala concert actually happened on the day of the Kherson flooding, so she spoke emotionally about that and called Russia a terrorist state, and called on all of us to continue, making this known and voicing that. And just many artists from Ukraine, many of the famous artists are touring the world to try to raise awareness and funds for the war relief effort. Onuka, actually above here, she's a descendant of a Sopilka, an Ukrainian instrument maker. She's recently posted a song called Peremoha, which is also really, really an interesting piece. I encourage you to listen. So it's not only about people being targeted, but also our cultural identity, language, and history. The vandalism and targeting of our country's cultural sites is nothing short of a genocide by Russian forces. So this was Oleksandr Tkachenko, of course, Ukraine's Minister of Culture. And I think it's important to keep that in mind, because we are often asked, why aren't we, this isn't, the cultural front is not quite the same as being on the actual front. And to that, of course, we all agree. But I think it's important to recognize that the destruction of cultural sites, of Ukrainian museums, is part of this cultural genocide and is very much a part of Putin's war. So this is a non-exhaustive list of just the genocide and destruction, and also the thievery that's been committed by Russians in Ukraine since the start of the full-scale invasion. Just top left there, we have Polina Raiko's house, which she was a Ukrainian painter, sort of painted in the primitive form that Maria Primachenko painted in as well. But her house was essentially destroyed in the flood. Similarly, Maria Primachenko's museum in Ivankiv was attacked and many of her paintings destroyed. I think some of them were saved, but still many destroyed. We have just a Gothic 19th century building destroyed. The Mariupol Drama Theater, another terrible example. And of course, that's not an exhaustive list, and there are many more examples of that. And many works have been stolen. Hunzi, his artwork has especially been targeted in the war. So a lot of his works were in Mariupol and Berdyansk, and they've been stolen. Scythian gold has been stolen. So it's been truly just savage. So I think if we don't find time for our culture now, Russia will achieve its goal. Our culture makes us who we are. Therefore, in the time of war, we have to make the culture. I think this is well said by Serhiy Kulibyshev. He's a Ukrainian screenwriter and director. And I think this extends to people who are maybe not necessarily creating art, but art proponents, such as myself. So I think it's important that we continue the work of spreading awareness of Ukrainian culture. And I think that becomes very clear in other examples. So as we discussed, and notably, there's been some attempts in Kyiv and other cities recently to decolonize, the Soviet history. Oleg Slabospitsky of Ukrainian Kyiv is a very prominent example of this. They've already taken down 200 signs and monuments. There's a Telegram channel that basically tries to capture these moments of where people are taking down monuments. And this has been an extension. Actually, there was a decommunized movement, happening even before the Maidan Revolution, but especially during the Maidan Revolution. But since then, it's really extending to, we need to decolonize and especially de-Russify. And we've noticed, people have noted that people are switching more and more to using Ukrainian and stopping using the Russian language. So I think that's been a positive change there. And just some examples, you see the crack that was painted onto this arch, and it was renamed the Arch of Freedom of the Ukrainian People. Mosaics are being questioned and graffitied, statues are being defaced. So all sorts of examples such as that. And then there's Gamlet Zhimkivsky. He's a Kharkiv-based street artist, and he stayed in Kharkiv and has continued to paint art related to the war and the occupation. So the one on the top right here is called Pekalna Hostinist, or hellish hospitality. So, emphasizing that, the Russian invaders were not greeted positively when they invaded. And I've also put down here, the enemy is Putin, not Pushkin. That was from Penn, Germany, which I think is very problematic on many levels. I think to that, Ukrainian artists and Ukrainians have been saying Pushkin unfortunately has been used by Putin even when Crimea was annexed. They had children read Pushkin poems, so obviously it's been used as a tool to propagate Russian propaganda. So the enemy is not just Putin, it is Pushkin, I would say, as well. And to point to other examples of decolonization, especially in the visual art scene, Yulia Berdyarova, who's at the Museum Ludwig in Cologne, Germany, has helped change the spelling to the correct spelling of cities, as well as artists like Alexander Bohomazov, and also has rightfully reclaimed the heritage of artists like Malevich and Yermolov. Oksana Semenik, I would be remiss if I did not mention her in this presentation because she's been excellent. She has a whole Twitter feed called Ukrainian Art History. I really encourage you to listen, to follow that, because she's been excellent at showcasing and bringing to the forefront Ukrainian artists and how it's been misappropriated as Russian over many years. And beyond that, some of the positive examples, the Louvre has been exhibiting some Byzantine icons from the Khanenko Museum. The Met recently corrected the nationalities of Repin and Punzi as well. So, and the Degas work, of course, was changed to dancer in Ukrainian dress. So just to highlight some positives before I talk about the negatives yet again. So MoMA, unfortunately, I recently visited the MoMA and I was quite disappointed in seeing some of the origins written on the little explanation cards, like Malevich, Russian, born Ukraine, even though he really identified as a Ukrainian and was born in Ukraine. I don't know what the purpose there of even saying Russian is. Same with Ilya Kabakov. He's born in Dnipro, so why are we in Jewish Ukrainian who immigrated to the US? So why are we emphasizing the born Russia there again? Same with Exter, Alexandra Exter, Russian even though born in Poland and had Ukrainian parents, and opened an art school in Kyiv. So some questions there that definitely remain. And I wanted to end on a positive note. I think the Met Opera, as I already alluded to earlier with in contrast to the OSM, has been doing so much in terms of, I think, supporting Ukraine, both with bringing Ukrainian artists to the forefront. You can see here on the left, this is a wall dedicated entirely to Ukrainian artists at the Met. Vladislav Bulavsky is actually right here, and he's seen also in this image performing. He was the one who sang initially when the war broke out, and then he sang again during the 1-year anniversary of the war concert, where they actually played Mozart's Requiem to honor the soldiers who passed, as well as Beethoven's Fifth to support the future victory of Ukraine. So I think that was very powerful. And you can see the background blue and yellow flag that they had for that 1-year anniversary concert. And then basically since then, they've kept Ukrainian flags. And they had this in the program. Thanks Ukraine for defending democracy for the free world. From the start of the Russian invasion in 2022, the Met has stood in solidarity with Ukraine in its fight for liberty and freedom, and we shall continue to do so until Ukraine defeats its oppressor. So again, that's the exact opposite of some of the examples I showed where people don't name the oppressor. They don't call out Ukraine specifically as fighting for Western democracy. And I think the Met is a nice example of the kind of support Ukraine needs right now in the cultural sphere. So I'll end there, and I guess we'll save questions to the end. I'll let Leah speak a little bit, or if you have any questions now, I'm happy to take them as well if they're burning. I think, oh.
I don't see anybody with questions, so perhaps we should move on for the moment.
Right.
I'm just going to speak. I did not prepare a beautiful PowerPoint the way Nadia did, but I'm very grateful that she showed some images from some various projects that I've been involved in that I'm going to speak about. And so Дуже вам дякую for the opportunity to be a part of this, and greetings from Lviv. I apologize in advance if there's an error rate alarm. I will have to log off and go to the basement and log back in, but hopefully we won't have to deal with that. So when I was invited to be a part of this panel, it was a really important, useful opportunity for me to reflect on sort of the challenges of this question around decolonizing Ukrainian art and music specifically for me, given my area of expertise. And so I thought I'd talk a little bit first about kind of the challenges of that project actually before the full-scale invasion, and then how that has changed to some extent since February of 2022. And then just to give some perspective about some of the conversations that have been going on in the spheres that I work in music, in New York City, as well as in academia. I know Antisha is an academic organization, so I hope that will be of interest to some people. So I would say that before, so let me rewind and say that yes, I used to be Musa president, and we, our sort of era of Musa, did some really exciting things that I'm really proud of. And a lot of those included cultural activities, including the concert of Ukrainian song. And I suppose that was one of the very first moments where I sort of caught the bug of like wanting to organize Ukrainian cultural events, particularly around music. But my sort of professional interest in Ukraine and in Ukrainian music came in 2019. I did a research trip to Lviv and to Kyiv to look a little bit at how concert programming had changed in the 5 years since Maidan, because my sense from a distance was that there had been a real shift in kind of who was being performed, even by some of the real like mainstream organizations, as well as festivals that had developed and themes. And so that was sort of a small project that I undertook on my own. And while I was in Kyiv meeting with composers, I in conversation actually with one composer in particular, Ludmila Yurina, we thought we should really do some kind of concert of Ukrainian music in New York, because there's a lot of really cool, interesting things happening in Ukraine, and nobody knows about this in kind of the New York new music scene. And as a music person, my feeling was, if you're interested in new music, if you're interested in the cutting edge of what composers are doing, Ukraine has a lot to contribute to that conversation. And we should sort of create a space where people in New York City, granted, this is kind of a niche market, but in New York City would have the opportunity to uncover this side of Ukraine. And so from the start of the festival itself, the first 2 years of the festival, the sort of attempt to decolonize, so to speak, Ukrainian music was really focused on contemporary culture, and to kind of show Ukraine as this cutting edge place that was doing really exciting things that contributed to the contemporary discourse. And obviously to identify that with Ukraine as the contemporary independent sovereign nation. That has changed a little bit since February of 2022. And that's reflected somewhat in our programming of the festival, because what we realized is something that really needs to happen in addition to showing the world, hey, Ukraine is cool and interesting and has a lot of exciting projects going on and creative people, is that actually this has been a part of Ukraine for a long time. This is not just the Ukraine, new Ukraine, as I often hear people say, and I've used that terminology as well. This is something that actually goes way back in Ukrainian cultural history, but has been swallowed up mostly by a kind of Russian narrative. And either artists have been completely erased, or they have been absorbed as Russian or Soviet, or some kind of description that separates them from their Ukrainian identity and from their Ukrainian colleagues. And so this past year, which was the 4th year of the festival, we organized it around the anniversary of Boris Yeltsin-Sky's death. And so there we were able to kind of say, look, like, this is not just new music, this is music from 100 years ago that was equally cutting edge and avant-garde and engaged in trends of modernism from Europe. I mean, that is another sort of narrative that's been very important to push in my sort of public-facing musicology, I guess I would say, but also in my work as a scholar, to kind of deconstruct this idea that Ukraine has always operated under the sphere of like great Russian culture. And so any modernism that came out of Ukraine was coming out of Ukraine as a result of the influence of Moscow or Petersburg. And actually to point out that no, that's not true at all. In fact, a lot of these things moved from Ukraine into Russia. And Ukraine was sort of there first. And actually Ukrainians were very much in dialogue with the European modernist movements. I'll talk a little bit more about that when I talk about sort of the academic sphere. But that's one of the ways in which I think our purpose as a festival and as a public-facing organization has changed in light of the full-scale invasion. So really emphasizing the connections of Ukraine to European culture, even to American culture, and away from Russian culture, as well as to kind of highlight the creative spirit of Ukraine that is very much alive today, but also has a very long history. So to that end, I'll start by talking a little bit about the concert at Carnegie Hall, because I think that's probably the best known. It was certainly the largest scale project that I've been involved in. We started planning that project long before the full-scale invasion. I started discussing it as an idea with the former head of Fulbright Ukraine, Decolonizing, who unfortunately passed away in 2020. So we started speaking about this long before the full-scale invasion. And at the time, the idea for us was to emphasize how Ukraine was deeply connected to American culture and to kind of show Americans that this beloved part of their holiday culture was something that had grown up in Ukraine and had been brought to them by Ukrainians. Again, once the full-scale invasion started, then there was a bit of a shift in terms of messaging. That was still very important, but it was also very important to highlight the ways in which the 2022 full-scale invasion was repeating some of the history of the destruction of the Ukrainian National Republic in 1920, right? So this chorus was sent, the chorus that brought Shevchenko to North America was sent on a cultural diplomacy mission as part of the newly founded Ukrainian National Republic. And before they could return home, that had been destroyed and the Soviet Union had been established in at least Eastern and Central Ukraine. But the idea was that they were sent by Petlura to kind of share with the world Ukrainian culture as an independent thing. And so we were sort of once again trying to underline that, both in terms of these are the challenges Ukrainian culture faces, and this is also the richness of Ukrainian culture. I will just say, because I think maybe it will be interesting to some people here, that one of the challenges that I ran into with the concert programming post full-scale invasion was trying to strike the right balance between emphasizing the current war, the current invasion, the current destruction, and also the Ukraine's separate cultural value. I was very worried and very concerned that focusing too much on connecting this event with the full-scale invasion would lead to a way of thinking about Ukraine, which is right now we care, we're invested because of this horrible war, but when the war's over, we don't really need to think about Ukraine anymore. Then Ukraine's okay, and we can, we as Westerners can kind of go back to our lives. And the whole idea of this concert pre-full-scale invasion was to show Ukrainian culture really has value in and of itself. And so striking that right balance between drawing attention to the need for political support, financial support, all of the things that are absolutely necessary right at this moment, right at that moment, as well as saying, we're not here to celebrate Ukraine because this thing is happening, but we're here to celebrate Ukraine because Ukraine is something worth celebrating, regardless of what Russia is doing. That for me was a big challenge. And I think that has continued to be a challenge with Ukrainian cultural events. And so I guess that something as we as people who are interested in culture, people who organize cultural events, proceed in the current circumstances. I think that that's something to definitely be kind of cognizant of, because the end goal is to make sure that Ukrainian culture is remembered and cherished and understood as something separate from Russian culture, and not just as a victim, but as something that stands on its own. And so there was a lot of kind of negotiating around the Shevchenko concert of like how much needed to be about the full-scale invasion and how much needed to be about the history and how much needed to be about the music. So I'm happy to answer more questions about that if that's interesting to anyone. Similar issues have come up around the organization of my festival. So once again, one of the things that we have always tried to do is to engage American musicians. So obviously it's very important, especially now, to give Ukrainian musicians opportunities to perform, opportunities to work abroad, opportunities to be cultural diplomats. However, I have always stood by the statement that Ukrainian music is not only for Ukrainians. And if you want that to be true, then non-Ukrainians have to play this music. It has to become part of their repertoire that then they take into, completely different spheres, cultural spheres, to completely new audiences. And that was something that, both in terms of artists themselves reaching out to me and saying, would you be interested in bringing my ensemble to come and perform, as well as journalists. We had a lot of journalists who were very intensely focused on wanting to talk to the performers of Ukrainian heritage about how this was affecting them. And that's important, and that has its place. But again, I think it's also very important that, if you think about who is playing Rachmaninoff, it's everyone, right? Like that's what we want for Ukrainian music too. We don't just want to hear Ukrainian interpreters. Now, they, of course, are wonderful, and in some instances have a lot more insight into a work than an American performer. But luckily in New York, we have, very high caliber musicians, and I think have a real opportunity to kind of slowly, it's a slow process, it is, but to slowly kind of disseminate Ukrainian music into the hands of people that will help carry it beyond the Ukrainian community. And that's like really crucial, I think, for the future of Ukrainian culture, and in a way of decolonizing, right? Like, I think that if you start to see a culture as something that's universal, that's universally accessible, then it starts to have its own history. Whereas if it's just kind of a subset of another culture and it's only played by those people, then it sort of stays in this like separate and sort of not serious category. To that end, in my own work as a scholar, so as Professor Zhuk mentioned, I'm currently researching a book about Ukrainian musical modernism. This project began originally as a project that was supposed to look at the last 100 years of Ukrainian music. Basically, the last 100 years has divided into 4 generations of composers: the modernist composers of the 20s and 30s, the Shevchenko, the post-independence generation of the 90s, and then the post-Maidan generation, who are sort of younger, who grew up entirely in a free Ukraine and are sort of in their late 20s, early 30s now. Since the full-scale invasion, that project has changed. That's partly because, obviously, my access to materials is limited. Kharkiv, for instance, which has a great, rich cultural heritage, is like not accessible at all to me at this time. And so I sort of was looking at my project and thinking, what do I have the most information about? And the most information that I have is about the modernist period. But I also think that there's much more of an audience now. I think that there are many more people in the sphere of, sort of academic music studies who want to know about Ukraine and who are interested, therefore, in a more detailed, sort of a deeper dive on a narrower topic. And so I've decided to focus an entire book on the modernist group, of which I have to say there is absolutely more than enough for a single book and maybe for several books. with the idea that, maybe this will be a series of volumes, and then, down the road, we can, think about writing about the Shistasapniki and post-independence and post-Maidan. So that's a real positive that I've noticed. And my approach to this topic which is completely informed by the facts, has been to highlight the connections that Ukrainian artists have had to modernist movements of Europe. Okay, so not at all sort of under the shadow, under the sphere of the Russian world. Quite to the contrary, if you just look at the facts, many Ukrainian composers went and studied composition in Europe, were engaged with a lot of the cutting, sort of the avant-garde European musical ideas. Some of those ideas were even sort of active in Ukraine before they were active in Europe. So there's a really rich dialogue between Ukrainian musical history and the sort of story of 20th century music that we are interested in, that looks at various movements. I don't know how sort of musical people are, but things like Impressionism and Expressionism and neoclassicism and, the questioning of the tonal system. I mean, all of those things were things that are sort of define 20th century music and very much define what Ukrainian composers were doing as well. So again, I'm happy to talk a little bit more about any of that if anyone has questions. But sort of the same through lines here that, this is Ukrainian culture has its own story to tell, and it's a story that's separate from Russian culture, and that's something that needs to be sort of continually repeated as we engage with musical performance as well as with musical scholarship. But I will say that I, like probably everyone in this Zoom call, has experienced this resistance to canceling Russian composers, Russian performers. And I will say that I think there's a difference between those two things. And it's not, I don't want to act like, oh, this is so easy and it's so ridiculous that everyone is, struggling with it. I'm sympathetic, even though to me, it does seem very easy. But I will say that I think that one of the most powerful responses that I have learned to have when people object to the cancellation of, and in here I'm just going to talk about Russian composers. So in the same way that, like, there was this resistance to, cancel Putin, not Pushkin. I think it's very, very important to acknowledge the fact that, unfortunately, or fortunately, it's just the fact that culture is political, and this idea that culture or art can be separate from politics is ridiculous. And as a historian, it's a fantasy. Culture has always existed in relationship to its political situations, whether that's reacting against or supporting or just being kind of a result of. It is just the fact that is true. And part of that means that music and culture has been used by political regimes very effectively. I mean, for good reason. Culture moves us. Culture has a very powerful effect over people, right? Music, art, literature, and governments aren't stupid. They know that. And so they use culture to help their own agendas. And the fact of the matter is that Russian imperial and then Soviet culture has used certain composers very, very effectively to support Russian identity and Russian chauvinism and Russian imperialism. And it is in a way too bad that Tchaikovsky, and I'm just using him as an example because in the musical world, he's been a huge kind of flashpoint, that he has become this flashpoint because actually, music, historically speaking, he was the outsider composer. He was not the Russianist. He was criticized for being too Western in his approach to composition. He was queer. There were all of these sort of issues. I mean, he wasn't, he was a problematic figure in his day, but the fact is that he has become the sound of Russian power. And that isn't anything that anyone can change as much as we may want that. And so we have to acknowledge that for some people in the world, the sound of a Tchaikovsky symphony is the sound of oppression. And that just is. And so you can either respect that and decide not to play that music because you're respecting the experience that it will create for some of your listeners, or not. But that is a fact. And what you do with that information, then I think you have to take responsibility for. And when I say you, I'm sort of talking to the OSM, the various, I live in Vienna most of the time. The Vienna Philharmonic still programs plenty of Russian composers. And the example of this is that, after 2008, when Russia invaded Georgia, there was a concert that Gergiev organized in sort of the town square of one of the destroyed cities in South Ossetia. And the program was Tchaikovsky, Shostakovich, Tchaikovsky. I often find that people are pretty responsive when I compare that sort of utilization of music to the Nazi utilization of Wagner and even of Beethoven. People seem to understand that better and understand why it is that some people wouldn't want to hear that music and understand its political connections. So I suppose it's sort of a tool. That's something I might propose to anyone on this call. It's been an effective comeback. And I think it's also important to say, this is not, my feeling is this is not to halt, the study of any culture from forever, from today until eternity. But I think that the treatment of culture has to be very much like the treatment of any other political treatment. So this is a sanction that we're calling for, and the sanction is a cultural sanction. And given Russia's incredibly intelligent use of culture as a propaganda tool, it's a really important cultural sanction. And so, when Russia itself is decolonized or democratized or whatever, we can return to talking about these things in a historical context, to talking about this music. But now is not the time to hear Russian voices, I think. I feel quite strongly about that. Same goes for performers. And I would say that from an American perspective, especially, given the need and the call for the greater representation of BIPOC performers, it just is, it's a no-brainer. You pull a Trebko and you give the role to a person of color. We can sort of resist Russia and also promote diversity in one fell swoop. And I think that's kind of a no-brainer. So I realize this is a passionate topic for me, as I'm sure it is for everybody. And I've kind of gone a little bit on a tangent here about some of these issues. And I do want to make sure that if anybody has questions, we can answer them. So those are some thoughts. Those are some experiences that I've had in my various spheres of engagement. And yeah, I'd be really happy to answer questions or hear from any of you, experiences, thoughts, feelings, questions, comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Batstone and Dr. Demko, for your very interesting summary. I see there's already one hand raised. So please raise your hand if you wish to ask a question. But I just wanted to perhaps start with a comment that I'm very, very happy that you raised this subject of how the Soviets in particular before, and Russia continuing now, use culture as a propaganda tool. I think it's extremely important to realize this. They developed this sense, and I remember this through the many years that I attended the Montreal competition, when you sometimes would have 3 or 4 competitors, most of whom were Ukrainian. Oh, the Russians are coming. Les Russes sont là. It's always been like that. And to try to change people's minds about this is extremely difficult because it's done very well. It's done subtly, and we have to be able to do this as well. Okay, I see several people with, I'm just not sure how to enable this. I need to go to the participants, I believe. Yes, okay. And the first question was from, I believe, Mr. Ostapchuk.
Yes, hi. Thank you very much for the presentation, for the event. I have a concrete question. The other day, I just chanced upon the Toronto Summer Music Festival. If you can Google Toronto Summer Music, or the URL is torontosummermusic.com. They have Ilya Ovcharenko, and he does two Debussy numbers. But there's, for example, and again, this may be unfair, but there's Sondra Radovetsky, and she's doing a program, the very last thing, on Ukrainian art songs. And there's Rachmaninoff, three numbers by him and others. And of course, I wonder, in 2010, the Ukrainian Art Song Project was inaugurated at the Royal Conservatory of Music, which is also the sponsor of the Summer Music Festival now in July. And it was a great event. I mean, it was really marvelous. And the whole project is a perfect thing for promoting Ukrainian music. I mean, the CDs, the concerts, the website, the materials that are available on their website. And my question is, again, this may be unfair. I was sort of hoping there'd be more Ukrainian content, and I don't know if Sondra Radovetsky knows who these Ukrainian art song composers are. She's doing her Carnegie program, so maybe that's what it is. But I'm just wondering, it's been 10, 13 years since the program, since the project began, and many ZTs, CDs have come out. Has it made an impact? Does the music world know enough about this music? Is it, I'm just wondering what the people that are in music here can tell me about that.
So I will underline what you said, that Ukrainian Art Song Project is amazing, and please tell your music friends. It is an absolutely tremendous resource, and has been a huge amount of work. And I'm just really in awe of the team, and to Pablo Hunka for putting it together. In my experience, no, unfortunately. A lot of people who reached out to the festival following the full-scale invasion, were asking, where can I find Ukrainian music? And it was news to almost everyone.
In this particular festival, in this one too, in this Toronto one.
I just mean the Ukrainian Contemporary Festival, Contemporary Music Festival that I run. So, we had people write to us and say, we'd like to do something by a Ukrainian composer. Where can we find information? Where do we find scores? And that's exactly what this project does. I think, yeah, it's a slow process. And I do think that getting this music into the hands of non-Ukrainian singers and also singing teachers is really important. So I think that's something that, it has to sort of become widely known beyond Ukrainian circles. And I'm not a PR person. I don't really know how you go about doing that in a really effective way. I don't know who you sort of advertise to in a way that's effective. I don't know if you have to reach out to, specific individual instructors or to libraries, or I don't know, but it is a great project, and it is, I think, still not well known enough, because it is an amazing resource, and they've done an incredible amount of work to ensure that these scores are available for every voice type, for every vocal range, in transliteration, in translation, it's really like,
What
are the reactions?
One would think that the great music schools, the Juilliard Arts, would know about this. And
raise hand there.
Not really.
Right here, raise hand.
Basically. There. I guess not yet. It hasn't happened really yet. It hasn't become currency.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I don't know I don't know about their outreach. But yeah, I would think that what they need to do is go straight to all the best vocal programs and say, do you know about this? And if you're looking for art songs for your students, here's something to look for. I mean, I also wonder how much of it maybe a hesitation on the part of professors to not teach these things because they themselves don't know them. And then there, the issue is getting performers to perform these things so that it becomes familiar to them and known, and therefore something that they can pass on to their students. I mean, I do think it's a slow project, but I agree that it's an incredible resource and that it's not well known enough.
Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Monchak. You're still muted.
I think I'm unmuted now. Yes, thank you. Thank you for a nice presentation, and hello to Ukraine in view. I have one request, is that us who are trying sometimes to argue in favor of Ukrainian content or de-Russification of Ukrainian content, we need information. I found, and there's very little available unless we start digging ourselves. Like I just discovered yesterday that the grandfather of Gershwin was a Jew from Odessa. Interesting. What Nadia Demko wrote to La Sena, the article, was I found very good. And it is something to which I can hang on and to promote whenever a discussion arrives. I haven't seen anything of that sort, but I think it's important for us to have that information so that we can promote it. With Shtedrik, Carol of the Bells, this was a good start. I was asked here in a village to talk about Leontovich because a local choir was performing Shtedrik. We had a Christmas concert. So I had to dig a bit. And then I found out that the American composer who wrote Carols of Bells is the same one who wrote the Battle Hymn of the Republic, I think, which everybody knows. Anyway, so we need that sort of information. It needs to be accessible. So perhaps it's a project for connoisseurs to have factual data available so that we can then promote it. So that's my request. Now, my philosophy, this is my second part, and if I may take 2 minutes, I heard Leah Batstone mention cancel culture. It's very in vogue now, and there's a lot of debate in the general public about it. But it has sort of a little negative connotation because anything canceled, everybody is nervous. How about taking the other approach, which is also very much in vogue, which is cultural appropriation, and putting that foot first and trying to de-Russify Ukrainian content under the guise of cultural appropriation. Composers such as Stravinsky was Ukrainian, Prokofiev was Ukrainian. Donetsk airport was named after him. Perhaps we should try to present this look. This is cultural appropriation by Russia. And this is something a lot more palatable to the general public. So on the one hand, we need to promote, as Leah said, we need to promote Ukrainian content, but on the other hand, to recuperate the cultural appropriation that was taken away from us, that was used to take away from us our culture. So that's just my 2 cents worth. But thank you very much for a very, very interesting talk.
Thank you, Dr. Monchak. Next, I think Mr. Dashko.
Дякую. Thanks as well for a really, really fascinating presentation. Particularly want to thank for pulling in the visual arts. And I'm wondering, do you have next steps in mind on what you want to do moving forward?
The question is
assuming the silence suggests that you may not have anything concrete, and that's perfectly all right.
I'm just asking, is the question to Dr. Batstone or to generally, or?
Both, or either one.
Well, I can answer for myself. The festival is ongoing. The Ukrainian Contemporary Music Festival is ongoing. It's something that we're growing slowly. And we, like I mentioned, the fact that I think our mission has changed somewhat since the full-scale invasion means that, I think we will be presenting ourselves and Ukrainian music in a slightly different, in a more historical context. I mean, we're still very much focused on contemporary music, but in connecting that contemporary music to a long history. And I think increasingly making that part of our presence in the New York music scene. So additionally, I am co-editing a volume with Peter Schmeltz, who is a musicologist at Arizona State University and has published a terrific book on Silvestrov. We are co-editing a volume called Perspectives on Ukrainian Music, which has over a dozen contributors at this point, people who are in Ukraine, who are outside of Ukraine, all of whom have contributed a chapter on some history of Ukrainian music. And we have tried to suggest to our authors that they write it in a way that makes it sort of accessible to an educated general audience. So not that it's so sort of lofty and scientific that it would be, beyond a general readership. So that's something that we hope that when that is out, it will then become a resource. There will be information in English, sometimes in translation, about sort of the history of Ukrainian music from all of its different facets. I just organized an academic conference on Ukraine in music history at the University of Vienna last month. We will be doing a publication from that as well. So that will also be in English and will be available as a kind of compendium of different perspectives on various aspects of Ukraine's place in music history generally. I'm also in some discussion now with a professor at Le Sorbonne to do a conference there next year, which would similarly produce recordings, and then consequently a volume. Some of these things are in the academic sphere, I realize. That's sort of where I am, but those are some next steps that are sort of in the books for me.
That's tremendous. And following up on Yuri's request, would it be possible for any of this stuff to be posted online?
So there are recordings of the presentations from the conference last month online. They're on YouTube. The conference itself was called Ukrainian Music History. And if you just Google that, we have a website, and the website has a link to the YouTube videos. There will certainly be electronic versions of all publications. That's now sort of the norm. I think it will probably be up to the publishers whether those things are totally open access or not. That's sort of beyond, I think, my powers, but I will do my best.
Right.
Maybe you can throw the link into the chat if you have a second.
Yes.
Thank you.
And I just wanted to add, Dякую for your question, Pan Dashko. I just wanted to add that, as a physician, this stuff's very much sort of been the stuff that I do part-time. And I think I would just encourage everyone in this audience to, when you read something that annoys you, because you know that it's either, been appropriated as Russian and it's not Russian, or, just blatant Russophilia, I just encourage you to write to whoever wrote that, So I think that's sort of my purpose here, is to give a perspective that's not like Leah has this very extensive musicologist and historical musical perspective. And I think this is an interesting conversation to have, to talk about how we can consolidate resources for people. And I think this is a great conversation, but I also would encourage people to respond, because I think that's part of the issue. Is you have the Leahs and the Irene Zhuks and the Luba Zhuks and the Radoslav Zhuks who are trying to get Ukrainian music out there and to get it on a professional level, have it played in North American in audiences and European audiences. And I think we need more people doing that. And I think we just need more activism just on a kind of daily basis. I was actually at the Ukrainian Museum's Decolonize Ukrainian Culture talk recently, and someone I think he's an architect actually. So this is, I think, your sphere, Pandashko, from the Cooper Union. And he was talking about this whole, basically, I don't know if you were following it, but basically they wanted to have this Russian Bauhaus display. And it was just not good timing. You know, the Cooper Union's actually in the Ukrainian village in New York City, full-scale war happening right now. And there was some backlash from the Ukrainian community. However, this guy as part of the discussion brought up that essentially the Ukrainian community was less vocal than the Russian one. So I think that just speaks to the fact that we need more Ukrainians and non-Ukrainians responding to these instances of blatant Russophilia and misappropriation of Ukrainian artists as Russian.
I'll have to keep an eye on the Cooper Union website a bit more often. Dякую.
It was in the New York Times.
Thank you very much.
On the New York Times too. Dякую.
Oh, sure.
I'll just interject another little comment. I always find that it must be very frustrating for our truly great Ukrainian musicians, because it is so difficult to have them hired across the water. They don't have the big propaganda machines that some of the others have. And this is really lamentable, I think. It would be wonderful if we could have more Ukrainian artists. I mean, I can name a bunch of them. Of course, we know Serhiy Salo here in Montreal, who won the great Montreal International Competition some 20 years ago. But we have others, and of course, the name escapes to me right now, winner of the Van Cliburn competition several years ago, who is Ukrainian, and we just don't hear enough of them. If we were able to offer orchestras such as the Montreal Symphony, which has this penchant towards Russians, viable alternatives. And of course, Serhiy Salo was an artist in residence with both the Orchestra Metropolitaine, and he was the invited artist on a tour of the Montreal Symphony. So there are inroads, but not yet enough. Now I'll go to the next question. Mr. Primak, would you please unmute?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, thank you.
Very good. Yeah, I have a couple of observations that I made during the talks. Firstly, I'd like to say that both of your speakers did a good job and brought a number of interesting questions to the fore. Regarding the first talk, it occurred to me that population statistics in Montreal are quite different from the other major Canadian cities. In Western Canada, there's an overwhelming majority of Ukrainians and relatively small numbers of Russians. In Montreal, by contrast, the Russian community is actually much larger. The Russian-speaking community, anyhow, is much, much larger than the Ukrainian one. So in a way, you can see why they can put up a stronger front in Montreal than in other Canadian cities. With regard to the second talk, I think that Leah did a good job. However, I would differ with her, I think, to a degree with regard to Tchaikovsky. Should we really give up on Tchaikovsky? I mean, he's probably the least Russian of Russian composers. Some people think he's the greatest composer of the Russian Empire. But should we really give up on him? He does have that Ukrainian aspect to his background and that sort of thing. And I really don't know about that. But it does bring up the general question of those Ukrainians which contributed to imperial Russian culture over the years. It's an important question. And their Ukrainian aspect is very often swept under the rug when we discuss this sort of thing. I'm thinking, for example, not only of Tchaikovsky in music, but of Gogol in Russian literature. and of Ilya Repin in Russian painting. Now, I've done some work on both of them, but especially on Repin, the painter. And I think he has a very strong Ukrainian background, and we shouldn't give up on people like that at all. We should be pushing them forward very strongly and stressing their Ukrainian aspect. And I think there's a campaign underway already to relabel him, reattribute his paintings to Ilya Repin, Ukrainian painter rather than Russian painter, or Ukrainian painter born in the Russian Empire. And it's important to put the empire in there and distinguish between the Russian Empire and Russia per se. So all of that's important. And so I would think I would disagree with Leah on that to some degree. There are also questions of practicalities. How can we influence the newspapers and the journals and the magazines to take things on subjects that they know very little about, and therefore their readership is unacquainted with and perhaps not really interested in to begin with? That's a practical question that I've faced already, and I'd like to get each of your takes on those particular questions that came up during your talks, to me anyhow. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Pumak.
No, I don't think at all we should give up on Tchaikovsky. I simply think that in this moment, we need to acknowledge Tchaikovsky's past utilization by oppressive powers, and the fact that for many Ukrainians, he sounds like Russian oppression. And my work in Ukraine, I mean, that has just come up over and over again. And I've heard Ukrainian composers and Ukrainian musicians say to me, I cannot listen to a Tchaikovsky symphony in this moment. So I think the moment has partly to do with that question. I mean, I think there is, identity is complicated. And when you're also dealing with identities within empires, that is also very complicated. And it is true that Tchaikovsky has some Ukrainian heritage, that his brother lived outside Kyiv. It's where he wrote the second Little Russian Symphony. I would be in favor of someone, maybe myself at some point, someone doing a really extensive study of what his real relationship to Ukraine was, because having a Ukrainian grandfather, that's not the end all and be all. I don't know if he was sort of in favor of the empire. I think that's like a very important question. And it's a question that also comes up in literature, whereas Gogol was really a dissenting voice. What do you do if you have a kind of a voice that maybe has Ukrainian heritage, but was very supportive of imperial aims? And I really don't know the answer to that question. That's something that I think really deserves some scholarly attention. And I don't at all dispute that he's a great composer, absolutely. But I do think that, for the moment, he has this connotation. And when he's being played by ensembles and by institutions that have clearly not made the effort to confront the realities of Russian cultural propaganda, that it makes it very hard for me to sort of think that they are using Tchaikovsky as a means of supporting Ukraine. So I think you can absolutely sort of reclaim cultural figures that may have been used to oppress, but I think that takes time, and I think it takes a kind of definitiveness, right? So if the Vienna Philharmonic is constantly inviting Russian performers and is still playing, basically not changed their programming at all, their performance of Tchaikovsky says nothing about their support for Ukraine. I think it has to be very intentional. But I don't think we should give up on him. I don't think we should give up on any,
That's right.
figure. I just think that, we have to acknowledge that he has this sound for some people, very much in the way that, Wagner had a certain sound for Jews that survived the Holocaust. Wagner, also a wonderful composer, but I think it takes some time, and it takes a lot of sort of intentional sort of retelling of the story. Mother-in-law's calling my Skype. Apologies.
Yes, I think just in reply, I think time and place are very important in these questions. So at the right time in the right place, we can have a great effect.
Yeah. As for getting journalists interested in these questions, the greatest success that I've had on this question is to engage Americans, engage American PR firms. So you find someone that's sympathetic as a PR agent who knows what the hooks need to be, and then you get them to do the work. You know, you find someone who has the expertise who is also then sympathetic. And I think that it's sort of similarly to sort of putting Ukrainian culture in the hands of non-Ukrainian musicians, you sort of put the Ukrainian story in the hands of non-Ukrainian storytellers, and then you get them to just work their magic. Our PR representative for the concert at Carnegie Hall was not Ukrainian at all, but he was extremely good at his job, and we told him the story and he was open to hearing the story, and then he was able to really effectively disseminate it. So I think kind of creating an alliance beyond the community with people who have, the certain skills that will help promote Ukrainian culture is really, really valuable in my experience.
Thank you.
And yeah, so thank you, Pan Premak, for the question, or I guess the comment about the population makeup of Montreal. So I agree with you. I think when I first moved here, that was something, I came from Winnipeg. So I noticed that almost immediately there's proportionally less Ukrainians in Montreal. However, I think that's not necessarily a reason to give up on trying to get the Ukrainian message out there, because you look at a place like New York City where Ukrainians are also quite diluted, but you have these pockets of Ukrainian cultural scenes that really are, try to react to some of these instances, and you have organizations, and because of that, you have organizations like the Met that stand behind Ukraine very, very strongly, 100%. So I think, I think that highlights that we can aspire to having more Ukrainian culture promoted, even in cities where there's a lot of Russian culture. So I think I would agree with that. I think that's what creates the challenging ecosystem that is Quebec. But I think that is also means that more of us can be, I think, writing. And I think to sort of talk, kind of discuss some of the, like you mentioned, you've tried to write some articles, and you've experienced, just people not wanting to either to hear the story. I think it's just persistence. It's not like you get a yes. You think with my La Scena article that I got a yes immediately. No, I mean, I tried it through other venues first of all, and then I think it's about being persistent and trying to explain the story. Even having conversations with these publishers. Same with Gazette and La Presse. La Presse was also it was multiple attempts, right? So I think it's persistence, and I think we need quantity. I think I got asked a question in the chat as well from Pani Kuplowska. About why are museums like MoMA slow to change? I think it's just a matter of force, and whether that should be organized or not, I don't know. I think yes, having organizations like the Ukrainian Canadian Congress and the U.S. equivalent of that, get behind letters. I think that's important, but I also think individual power is also should be harnessed, because I think just writing letters, and if they get a lot of letters, at some point they're going to have to or want to respond. So I think it's persistence, quantity, keeping at it, and not thinking that just because you do something else by day that you can't respond. I think that's my key message. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, both of you.
Thank you, Mr. Premak. Oksana Venetsko-Yusupowicz, would you please unmute?
I'm unmuted, I believe. Yes, you as well. So we're both here in this fine city. And thank you for the incredible presentations. Thank you for bringing up the whole issue of the Kulturny Front, as it's being called today in Ukraine. There's actually a hashtag associated with it. It's a very important part of the war effort and the effort that will be needed after the end of the war, Pісля перемоги, as is being said in Ukraine. Dr. Demko, I would like to really thank you for the emphasis you have placed on the Met Opera. At the same time, I'd like to mention the fact that Carrie Lynn Wilson who is a conductor with the Met Opera and who's also the wife of the current general manager, is very instrumental in promoting Ukraine. She is the one that created the Ukrainian Freedom Orchestra within the first few months, literally, of the Russian invasion. She did a tour of Europe. She has conducted in Ukraine recently. She is doing, she claims that, well, in her CV, she says she is of partial Ukrainian descent, and she does come from Winnipeg, where she obviously grew up in a Ukrainian environment, as you yourself have mentioned. I think these things need to be mentioned when we talk about companies and companies that do a positive impact. There is always someone within that company that is doing something right. It doesn't just happen on its own. And I think these individuals do need to be mentioned, if I may sort of say that, okay? In terms of Tchaikovsky, I'd like to support Dr. Premak. I do think we need to, Dr. Monchak has said cultural appropriation. We need to fight the cultural appropriation that has been done. Yes, very much so in Ukraine. The issue of Tchaikovsky is very controversial. Much discussion has occurred in Kyiv with the conservatory and how they are to be named. There have been streets that have been renamed. There is a lot of trauma associated with this. At the same time, as a Canadian, I'd like to mention the fact that in Edmonton, the Edmonton Shumka has always, or for many, many years, when the Nutcracker was performed with the ballet in Edmonton, they have always included a Ukrainian dance as part of the Nutcracker. So I think that that is also something that is it cultural appropriation, or is it returning to the roots of where we should be? That's also something that should be remembered. And so thank you so much to both of you.
Thank you very much.
I completely agree with your comments about, naming the people like Carrie Lynn Wilson. Yes, she's exactly how you mentioned her, at the forefront of the Met, driving the Ukraine program. So thank you for bringing that up. And that's why along the way, because I'm a little bit more familiar with the Montreal scene, why I had mentioned Taras Kulish with the OCM, because he's essentially the driving force for why it has Ukrainian programming as well. So I agree with you that often it's these individuals, and I think we need to give them credit as well, because will continue hopefully to motivate them to do the things they do, especially in the face of, the public attention of things like $200,000 that the Met needs to pay Natrebko. I think we need to be talking about the people that have been driving the positive change. Yeah, agreed.
If I may just mention about Carrie Lynn Wilson, there was a smear campaign that was towards her and after she started this campaign. So just let's remember that yeah, we do need to thank these people, because sometimes they also come up against a lot of hardships. Sorry.
Thank you very much. And it's also my pleasure now. I think we need to close the session imminently. And we've been going for 2 hours now. Thank you. Well, not 2 hours, an hour and a half. So thank you so much to all who participated. Thank you very, very much. Thank you so much for
I wanted to thank you, the three of you, because you've been instrumental in the music scene, and on the note of thanking people where it's due. Professors Ireneus, Luba, and Radoslav have been instrumental in the music scene in Montreal, and of course in driving Enteshe. So thank you for all that you do. I had this last slide, your support. So there's just a photo on the left of you coming to our events when we were organizing things as students. So again, thank you for always being there and for the support.
Well, thank you for the very kind mention. And thank you for these presentations. They've brought up a lot of interesting points. On the matter of Tchaikovsky, incidentally, or Tchaikovsky, which we should say perhaps, the Ukrainian Music Festival in Toronto for a good number of years considered Tchaikovsky a Ukrainian composer because his works are so wonderfully well written for instructing children. And I totally agree. I always say Tchaikovsky has Ukrainian background. We know that his best works, the works that he was happiest about, were all written in Ukraine, well, most of them, at Kamyanka. And this is because he felt good there, better than he felt in Moscow. At least that's what we like to think, but it's true. I mean, there's so much Ukrainian content in his. If you think of all the Ukrainian references he has in his works. So once again, thank you very, very much, both to Dr. Demko and to Dr. Batstone. And I hope that everyone will take to heart some of the suggestions. Thank you, and it's my pleasure to close this. Well, it's not my pleasure to close it, but it's my duty to close the session. Thank you so much, and I'm so glad that the internet finally worked out, because it was not easy. It was terribly, oh my, I was running up and down stairs and so on. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.